So we've heard about how plants make decisions, we've heard about how farmers make planting decisions, we've heard about how to make decisions as to what constitutes a good model or not. I'm going to be making the plea that history should be part of your thinking process about what constitutes good science, responsible innovation. Fair warning, there's going to be some discussion of racist language and thinking in this paper. And if you would rather sit that out, I think that's a respectable individual decision to make. But collectively, as academics, this is an issue that we need to face down. Time is brief. It's a big multidisciplinary audience. I'm speaking across several disciplines. Also, I don't actually work on responsible innovation. You'll have to invite me back another time for the legal studies paper. But I accept the challenge. I think given that context, the game plan is to be bold, be polemical, and get chunky. So, chunky. This is the thesis. Science is political. And let's go for the hardest case of that argument. It's not just the questions that science asks that are directed to some extent by funders, partners, political arrangements. It's the answers that science gives as well. Scientific knowledge is imprinted with the context of its construction, including the biases, agendas, and worldviews of its creators. What I'm arguing for is a materialist view of science. The material conditions of scientific practice matter. So, to put that very chunkily, I don't believe that Darwin did kill God, but I am here today to argue there is no such thing as transcendental scientific knowledge. To put that even more specifically, in terms of the case study I want to bring forward, taxonomy reflects and shares logical consiliences with the racist and colonial projects within which it was developed. Recognizing this fact is essential to responsible research and addressing the legitimacy crisis in academia more generally. So, this is Edward Harold Fulcher Swain. In 1899, he became the first cadet in the Forestry Service in New South Wales. He had a long and celebrated career in which he rose to be the director of the Forestry Service in Queensland and then in New South Wales in a later period. Let's focus in on Swain's time in Queensland. But first, to set the scene. As a forestry cadet in New South Wales, the government botanist instructed him to learn his trees. And what that meant doing was taxonomy. There are 465 records in the Australian Virtual Herbarium that were accessioned by Swain across his lifetime. Here's the digitized version of the plant material he placed in a box, and a photograph I took when I went to go and visit that box and open it up. This is Cryptocarya glaucescens, a type of laurel, something akin to the bay leaf you might use in your cooking. So when Swain moved to Queensland in 1916, these were the taxonomic tools that he had to hand. And one of the things he did with them was to launch a campaign to establish a new timber industry in response to the threat of a timber famine and growing concerns about dependence on British imports of timber. And to support that project, and as I say, using the taxonomic tools that he had to hand, Swain developed the Universal Index of Wood. What that meant was lists and lists and lists of Latinate and trade names with a number attached to each. So, a user of the index out in the forest, or more likely in the timber yard, would take a piece of wood and subject it to a series of tests, or schedules, as Swain called them, looking at the arrangement of vascular tissues, porosity, the type of ash that it would form. So, once you went through those schedules, each of them would assign a number, generate a number. You would amalgamate the numbers together, and that would give you the identifying number in the index and identify the piece of wood. In short, this was a system for identifying trees and the wood they would produce so that they might be turned into commodities, putting them into boxes, so to speak. This is the first publication of the index I can find in 1926. And this is taken from the American Journal of Forestry for quite interesting reasons we might get into in questions. And you can see some of the different schedules here on the right, each giving a particular decimal. This piece of casual racism, shocking casual racism, is taken from that first publication. It doesn't appear in subsequent publications in Australia. I'll let you read through these quotes because I don't really want to put these thoughts into my mouth, frankly. This is the racism that one encounters in the taxonomic world of the 1920s. The second quote is from Henry Tardant, a socialist agricultural reformer who was commissioned by the Queensland government to produce a propagandizing pamphlet to celebrate Swain and his work. The third quote is taken from Alfred Ewart, the first chair of botany in Australia at the University of Melbourne, and the Victorian government botanist. He was responsible for administering exams that were a prerequisite for entering the Forestry Service in Victoria. The quote is taken from the Sydney Sun, which had reprinted it from the Melbourne Herald. It was published under his name, title, and affiliation, and even copyrighted by him. Note that Ewart's chief complaint is that Indigenous knowledge is only ever relational, related to what can be eaten. And note that this sort of thinking, they wouldn't even know it if they were standing on it, even stripped of the explicit racism, is all too familiar today. Okay, so what to make of this? You could say that these attitudes were held by everybody in the period, but this isn't true. Naturalists like Friedrich Tiedemann, the anthropologist Franz Boas, the biological anthropologist Rudolf Virchow were arguing strenuously against these types of views in exactly this period. So you could argue that these views are incidental to the scientific knowledge these men produced. So let me take that challenge head on. The first thing to point out is that each of these men is writing in a professional capacity. These are not their private thoughts. But the deeper point here is that taxonomy is undoubtedly driven by the logic of putting things into boxes. There are aspects of taxonomy that are relational, especially systematic biology writ large and cladistics writ small. But the major upheavals and reworkings of the taxonomic order, which seem to occur very frequently, suggest that the relationships taxonomy points to are often fragile and in many ways superficial, especially as they relate more to relatives than to friends or communities. Mostly, as I say, it's putting things into boxes, precisely as Swain put his Glaucocene sample into a box and separated it from its connections and relations to place. And that logic of putting things into boxes underwrote the scientific racism which legitimated putting people into ships on an industrial scale during the age of Middle Passage chattel slavery. Sometimes it seems like almost everybody involved in biological science, from Carl Linnaeus through Robert Boyle, Buffon, Cuvier, Jefferson, Knox, arguably Darwin, definitely Galton, Davenport, Fisher, Pauling, and James Watson were part of the project of taxonomically backed scientific racism and its boxy thinking about humans. But to reiterate, not everyone, Tiedemann, Boas, Virchow. Boxiness wasn't just about supporting racism and the commercialization of human bodies and human beings, but also commercialization more generally. To have a commodity, you usually need a box to put it in. My contention is that the boxiness of taxonomy has supported and drawn from the capitalist projects of industrial slavery and settler colonialism. This is in part why the British Empire sent Banks and Solander to Australia. It's why Darwin ended up in South America. And it's why some of the oldest institutions in colonial Australia are its herbaria and botanical gardens. Taxonomy was an essential part of the process of dispossession, the structure of invasion. And look at what's being rejected here, the relational knowledge derided by Ewart. Indigenous, citizen, and marginal knowledge, if they are related by any central theme, are united, as Deborah McGregor has pointed out, for the case of Indigenous knowledge, by a deep relational view that stands in sharp contrast to the boxiness of taxonomy. Indeed, you see this movement towards relationality in the marginal sciences of the 20th century. Arthur Tansley's ecology, Conrad Waddington's epigenetics, Barbara McClintock's work on transposons, James Lovelock's Gaia theory, and Lynn Margulis's work on endosymbiotic theory. And these are all relational ideas that were derided in their time for not being appropriately divisive about the boxiness of life. And in many cases, they were explicit reactions against boxiness in thinking. I think there's also a case to be made as to why the return of epigenetics, G times E times M, or the interdisciplinary strategies of the centre represent a beginning on righting some of these partialities and biases. So, what is to be done? I've argued that scientific knowledge is imprinted with the context of its construction, including the biases, agendas, and worldviews of its creators. There is no transcendental scientific knowledge. Awareness of the limitations and biases of the disciplinary tools we use and the knowledge we produce should engender humility towards Indigenous, citizen, and marginal knowledge. And that should encourage engagement with diverse views throughout the research process, from funding call to publication. The best practice guidelines are a good start, but what we also need is deeper engagement with diverse views at the point at which the research agenda is being formulated, and then right the way through the undertaking. This is the message that one gets from Terry Janke or from Mookie Hackley in their work on Indigenous and citizen knowledge, respectively. I'm not, of course, suggesting that we abandon taxonomy, but that we adopt a more realistic attitude towards its history and what that entails. The same, I think, is true for reductivist molecular thinking or deterministic genetic thinking. Research fails, and its legitimacy is thrown into question when it is not in contact with the facts on the ground. And one of the facts on the ground is that invasion, as Patrick Wolf puts it, is a structure and not an event. A structure that continues to shape the world around us today, and a world which continues to shape scientific knowledge. This is the challenge of history, and responsible research requires us to accept and work to mitigate these facts by moving beyond academia, government, and industry partners. At least in part, by developing, as Naomi Klein has argued, the humility to learn from Indigenous teachings about the duties to future generations and the interconnection of all life, which appear to be humanity's best shot at collective survival. Precisely as Uncle Chegg suggested at the opening ceremony to this event, what's needed is a recognition of the value of the knowledge held by diverse groups. Thank you ever so much.